Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MemesteticA talks. I am Valentina Tanni, and I am the curator of this series of online conversations organized by Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art in Ljubljana. And the program is also part of the 11th edition of a larger series called Tactics and Practice. The main topic of this program, this online program, is of course the world of memes, and more in general is about participatory culture and the contents that are produced and exchanged online, with a particular focus on aesthetics, on visual languages, and also in relation with the history of modern and contemporary visual art. So the goal of this series is to investigate the role that this new cultural system is having in kind of reshaping our very idea of art, and also maybe the role of art in society. Today I have the pleasure to host Marc Tuters. Thank you, Marc, for accepting our invitation. Thank you again. Before we begin our conversation, I'm going to say a few words about you. So I'm going to introduce you to our online audience. Marc Tuters is an assistant professor in media studies at the University of Amsterdam, and he also works within a research group called OILab that studies political subcultures online. He published numerous papers on this subject and gave also talks in many cultural institutions across and events, cultural events across Europe. So the first question I would like to ask you, Marc, is about the origins of your research on internet memes, and I will ask a similar question to all our guests because I'm always very curious about foundational stories, and I think that it could be interesting to discuss the motivations behind long-lasting and in-depth researches like yours. So can you please tell us a little bit about how you got into studying online subcultures and memes, and what it is that interests you the most about memetics?
Sure. So I guess I'm relatively new to the subject. It was a few years ago, about four or 5 years ago, that I came upon this. The first thing that we did was make a kind of a map of thousands of Trump fandom meme pages on Facebook. This was back in the days when Facebook would let you do a lot more things with their API. And I was kind of, it was a bit of an eye-opening experience to see all of this, like, I guess what you could call dark fandom. So it's said to have started in a few years prior to that with an event called Gamergate, of which I had been aware as a teacher in course on video games myself. This phenomenon was said to have been recognized by Trump's campaign manager, Steve Bannon, before he was also the editor of Breitbart. The argument is that with the backing of billionaire dark money, figures like various kind of alt-right figures like Milo Yiannopoulos and so forth, weaponized meme culture, which it has been recently argued was always really essentially, in some sense, important sense, bigoted and reactionary by Whitney Phillips and Ryan Milner. But besides that, there's also the fact that the platforms are sort of designed to circulate this sensationalistic content, which is something that we had been aware of and studying in our field for some time. So there was a lot of attention at that point in time on the way that this occurred with relationship to fake news, post-truth, and so forth. But I think just as big of a story, and this is what caught my interest at the time, was the kind of mainstreaming of antagonistic fringe subcultures online. So that's what caught my attention and sort of set my interest in that area.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. And also, as you know, this series is focused on aesthetics. So we would like to discuss a little bit about how these images look and which is their visual characteristics. And so I saw that among all the aesthetic trends that we can see and identify in memetic imagery, one of the most visible is and distinctive, it's a growing weirdness, both in terms of form and content. And I know that you studied this particular aspect also in relation with the alt-right political groups, as you were already mentioning, and conspiracy theories. So can you please maybe tell a little bit about this weirdness? So what is the role of weirdness? Also the role maybe of nonsense and obscurity in the context of what you defined the deep vernacular web.
Sure. Yeah, weird is a really interesting category. You know, everybody has had a weird experience, an experience that they would categorize as truly weird. But what do we mean when we say that? I find an interesting reference point here comes from Marc Fisher, who himself refers to the writings of H.P. Lovecraft in defining the weird as a kind of intrusion into the familiar of something beyond or outside of it. And when you think about the weird in those terms, I think that our lives in the 21st century, in the last 20 years, have arguably been increasingly characterized by these kinds of like weird intrusions. You know, there was 9/11, there was the 2008 sovereign debt crisis, the refugee crisis, COVID. These familiar categories don't really make sense of these things. So people kind of go off in search of answers, and that sort of led to the rise of the independent researcher. And that's a category that you find with the alt-right, with conspiracy theorists and so forth, who are, and so, you know, we see all of these weird narratives emerging, you know, that, for example, that the elite are bloodthirsty vampires that are sort of sucking the vital essences out of people or children. This is like a popular, extremely popular, weird narrative on the internet. Some even say that it's the basis of a kind of the internet's first authentic religion, the QAnon myth. But what may seem weird to you and me can also be understood as a kind of a simple narrative of good and evil on the stage of world history that gives people a feeling of you know, that there's some sort of meaningful actors in world history themselves, where otherwise they might not feel that way. So I think it's kind of easy to make fun of these folks, but it's also possible to understand what attracts people to these kinds of things. And I think that sometimes these sort of extremist ideations can be understood, for example, as distorted versions of critiques of capitalism. For example, you know, that, like, just think of the ways in which social media actually do extract our vital life essences, like in the Matrix, as the basis of their business models. So I think that conspiracy theorists kind of tend to give conspiracy theory a bad name in a way, because I think that conspiracy theory can actually be a way to think about these things as well, where it's challenging to otherwise think about them. And I really like the writings of Eric Davis in particular in relation to this. He in his book High Weirdness, he writes about this guy in the 1970s, Robert Anton Wilson, who in part was responsible for popularizing the whole Illuminati conspiracy theory, but he was really using conspiracy theory as a kind of a way to critique what we would nowadays call, following Deleuze, the control society, the society of control. And Eric Davis suggests that we sort of need, what we need is, he calls it a hermeneutical flexibility, or a kind of an open-mindedness in order to be able to think through these challenging situations that we're in. And I guess you could say that conspiracy theorists the ones that we encounter in relation to stories like I just mentioned tend to think very stiffly. So we need a kind of a more hermeneutically flexible form of conspiracy thinking, I would say.
Yeah, but yeah, I totally agree on this. But I was wondering, from a visual point of view, I sometimes encounter very images that are very difficult to decode. They are very layered, very obscure, and sometimes also they maybe refer to a particular kind of aesthetic that someone called ugly aesthetics, that it's ugly on purpose, that it's distorted on purpose. What do you think about that? How can we interpret that preference with the images that are, ugly drawn, ugly designed, and maybe obscure on purpose? Sometimes they contain so many layers, maybe of meanings, that we lose track of the final meaning, or they are maybe sometimes nonsensical on purpose. I mean, they are nonsensical by design. Maybe I don't know. What do you think about this?
I mean, I think it's a challenging question that could be approached in different ways. You know, what is this sort of essence of this ugly aesthetic? I would have like a very kind of materialist and rather pragmatic kind of answer for this. I think it's the places that these images, those types of images emerge from, are characterized by an extreme kind of temporality, an extreme ephemerality, that where basically you have to do things very quickly in order to stay in the flow of the conversation, and things are constantly changing. It's there are these like highly vernacular spaces where even words kind of their value sort of diminishes rapidly, and especially images. There are spaces in which images function in many ways as words. So the aesthetic in that sense is a practical, it emerges practically from that kind of urgency of just basically doing something, making something quickly. On one level, that's an explanation for why these images look that way. I think that in terms of the other part of your question, the sort of ambiguity and so forth in many of these images, that's also characteristic of these kinds of spaces where expressions of sincerity are kind of dubious and highly sort of questionable. Nothing that is said there is ever necessarily what it seems. Nothing can be taken at face value. So this is also kind of very characteristic of a certain type of like language games that people play within these places. And I think that the images are then just sort of an extension of these, and maybe actually in many ways very much the center of these kinds of games that people play with language and paradox and ambiguity.
Yeah, right. Let's change subject for a minute. I read the essay you wrote for the Meme Manifesto project by 𝗕𝗏𝗏 that has just been published by Aksioma in the book The Detective Wall Guide that accompanies the exhibition by 𝗕𝗏𝗏. And in the text, you connect these acts of mapping memes and expose their meaning that 𝗕𝗏𝗏 are trying to do. An act that it's maybe impossible, but maybe also necessary in a sense. And you connect this act of mapping memes with the concept of cognitive mapping aesthetic that was mentioned by Frederick Jameson in his very famous article on postmodernism from 1984. So I was wondering if you can expand a little bit on that. And is it really possible to and necessary to map and organize these cultural objects, so memes and viral images, or is it just a desperate attempt to make sense of something that it's impossible to keep track of, something that is constantly evolving? and chaotic. So what do you think about mapping means?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the short answer is that it is both. But I would sort of just step back for a moment. Jameson, had a sort of take on conspiracy theory too. He saw a kind of a family resemblance between his idea of cognitive mapping and of conspiracy theory. So there is this idea in conspiracy theory, as within cognitive mapping, of trying to grasp the totality of everything and represent it. So as a classic kind of Marxist, he was concerned with the idea of totality, and he had a very there was a narrative within which you could make sense of things. That's the narrative of Marxism, which comes down to materialist factors of labor and so on, and expropriation. But he was also, more or less a postmodernist, or at least in the postmodern moment. And so within that framework, this is anything like that. Any grand narrative is sort of by definition for Lyotard impossible, or at least highly suspect. So there's this paradox in the position there, which he then tries to kind of work out. It's essential to the position. And I think that one way of looking at it, something also that Jameson said, is with it, like an idea like utopia. Utopia is also impossible, but for him it was nevertheless, necessary to keep in mind for a certain kind of political project. So I think it's like along the same lines. There are things that of course are literally impossible, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be sought after, especially in the arts.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Marc, and thank you for being with us. It has been a pleasure to chat with you, and thank you for being with us to our online audience, and see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you.